Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist. Today I'm finally ready to bring you my ranking video of every Tales to Give You Goosebumps episode adaptation from the original 90s show, and we're going to be ranking them from worst to best. It's been quite a few years for me to finally finish through all of these, and to be honest, I'm kind of glad it's over because I saved some of the worst ones or my least favorites for last. Sadly. But I will say this up front about the Tales to Give You Goosebumps episode adaptations. If you're not familiar with this concept or this idea, in the 90s TV show, I think as early as season 2, the show writers and showrunners started to pick stories from the Tales to Give You Goosebumps line of books. And if you're not familiar with those, it was a series of books that ran from 1994 until around late 1997. It ran 6 volumes and it had a total of 60 stories. And the show over time picked, I think, 9 to adapt into episodes in the show, one of which got a 2-parter. So technically, we got 10 episodes out of it. And there's also a very hard confirmed rumor that there was another one that went unmade because it was on the docket with another that did get made for consideration for a writer. So this series, I think, was the only series next to the mainline ones of the original 62 and Series 2000 that got adaptations in the show. So we never saw, the obscure stuff or Give Yourself Goosebumps get adapted in the show. And this, for many years, has made fans speculate not only onto the sister material within the Goosebumps medium at the time, but also speculate of what were the possibilities of the show if they were to continue and hypothetically, move on past the 2-parters that were only in season 4 to keep adapting more sister material. And a lot of people seem to think that Tales to Give You Goosebumps was just ripe, full of stories that could have made, I guess, entertaining television. And I can definitely see the appeal of why the showrunners wanted to pick some stories out of here, because if you look at all the facets of the original show, they couldn't adapt every mainline book because of budget. So they went to these short stories that were already probably better suited for scripting for them and inherently better for a 20 to 22 minute time crunch than condensing a, on average, 120 to 130 page book into 20 minutes. So they picked, these stories to get made, and they have some of the most all over the place fan reaction in the Goosebumps community, even till today. A lot of people seem to put a lot of the blame on the Tales to Give You Goosebumps adaptations for why the show started to get bad. And while that could be partially true, I don't necessarily put all the blame on them. And I actually think that majority of them are either underrated or really good and some of the best episodes of the whole show. Yes, I dare say it. I know there's some stinkers in here, and as we'll get into the video, you'll see which ones I'm referring to. But nonetheless, my thoughts on the Tales to Give You Goosebumps adaptations is they are mostly solid. They are like their brethren in the full book adaptations. They sometimes can be super faithful, but most of the time, if they're even on the more faithful side, they offer a new dynamic into the story that the short story just doesn't have, or they tweak an element that can possibly improve the concept, or they just take the concept and retweak a lot about it, and sometimes even go the whole in-name only route. So it makes them worthwhile to visit, and in all honesty, they mostly feel like Elseworlds versions of the story counterparts, kind of like majority of the episode adaptations, in my opinion. So I don't think they're a total wash. I think they're mostly entertaining. Like I said, not without its duds and some forgettable ones, but yeah, we need to stop putting the bad name on these episodes because there's a lot of good folks that did try with these, I feel. So take that for what you will. Now, because there's so many here, I didn't take the time to remember every writer and director for these, so I'm just going to talk about them from my memory and just give my opinions on them as we go along. So we have 9 total episodes, and like I said earlier, there's technically 10 because one is a 2-parter, but I'm going to be combining that one when we get to it as parts 1 and 2 together. So Starting from the worst, in ninth place. What is the worst Tales to Give You Goosebumps episode adaptation? It's going to Teacher's Pet for me. Now, Teacher's Pet, as you see back here, I gave about a 2 out of 5 stars. And it leaps and bounds is my least favorite of these adaptations because, honestly, it's next to my episode I have above this as not only the most forgettable one, but it's one of the most abysmal kids horror episodes I think ever made. And a lot of people seem to recognize Teacher's Pet as one of the worst things to ever come out of Goosebumps these days. And I think it's because of the social media age and a lot of people finally getting around to experience the whole show, because just a few years ago, the entire show was on Netflix for the first time ever. And people that had it, and millions of us do, they were finally able to check out some episodes they just never got around to watching when they were younger, or maybe forgot about. And this sparked a whole new hatred for this episode here. And I don't really think it's like in the contention for like the absolute worst things to ever come out of Goosebumps, but it's down there. It's pushing it. Now, this is pretty much an in-name only adaptation from its short story counterpart. There's the only thing recognizable are the character names like Becca, Benji, and Mr. Blankenship. But the concept is completely tweaked to where the kids, instead of being, new kids in a classroom with a new teacher they weren't expecting, and him having this weird collection of snakes around the classroom and them having to kind of figure out what's going on with that, the episode takes a field trip approach, ages up the characters a little bit, and puts them out in like a overnight camping situation where they're out in the woods, kind of looking at the nature side of things and the food chain. And they come across this eccentric field park guide who possibly perhaps is experimenting on animals, and they uncover a lab and a possible mutated creature hunting them down, right? Now, you would think that that would be interesting, but the episode is just really bland. The story is super generic. You don't feel anything about these characters. There's side characters in here that might as well not even be in the episode, because the only ones you really need to care about is Becca and Mr. Blankenship. They have easily the most dialogue. And the scenes we're supposed to be afraid of, it's just put together snake footage, and they spend a lot of focus on building up snake phobia, which isn't technically scary, but I guess if you're into that, good for you. But on top of that, the CGI effects and the concept itself just kind of falls apart. The CGI is awful, and then the concept literally makes zero logical sense, because science is apparently a plot armor thing that the show sometimes ran with, and because it's kooky, they can do whatever they want and just run with it. And you'll see that with the twist ending. Now, this episode also has the tragic urban legend backstory of the main actress who plays Becca, Michelle Reese, who died from meningitis shortly after filming this. That sparked the urban legend that somebody died on the set of the episode. That's been debunked for many years now. There are some solid acting performances here, and there's some good technical things outside of the CGI, like certain editing things that kind of work and that make it not totally awful all the way. But yeah, I really have nothing else positive to say outside of those things about it, so that's why it's here in dead last. All right, in second to last, we have an infamous episode that gets dunked on a lot, and that is Strained Peas. Strained Peas is a abysmal episode to the core. I think I gave this thing like a 2.6 out of 5 stars, which is a bad D- territory. Not quite F tier like Teacher's Pet. It doesn't really fall apart or just become terrible in execution. There is some aspects to it that are kind of quirky and funny. But man, is this episode also just a lost cause. Kind of like its other brethren. Strained Peas has a lot of differences to the short story counterpart, in particular with the angle of Nicholas being vastly different from the short story, and having a friend involved in the situation, unlike the short story, also kind of makes the concept tweaked a bit. And for some reason, they changed I think the sister's name in the short story was Hannah, and then they made her Grace in the episode. I want to say that's what it was. And some mechanisms of the baby, and especially the twist ending, is completely different from the short story. But man, this episode is just really boring, and it's very, very cringe. You know what I mean? This is one of the cringiest things you can find in the show. And this gives the Tales to Give You Goosebumps episodes a bad rep, in my opinion. This is the one that does it. If it's not Teacher's Pet. Concept about a kid. He's like an only child. He's 12 or 13 years old. His parents come home with a new baby sister. And then you have to go down the whole "you gotta believe me," because the kid realizes that his sister is kind of out to get him and maybe wants to remove him from the situation so she can have the parents and the family to herself. And yeah, I mean, there's really corny jokes in this episode. There's like one funny thing that happens, uh, dealing with a baby kind of channel surfing at midnight. There's like a funny reference to like looking up things you shouldn't be looking up as a kid, let's just say. But yeah, the acting in this episode isn't that good. The music is bad. The editing is bad. The ADR, oh my lord, the voice actor of the baby Grace in this episode is just ear grating. The effects with the mouth making the baby talk is next level bad. And then the twist even is kind of a MacGuffin. So take it for what you will. Strained Peas, not that good. I don't really have much else to say about it. It's just here. All right, but now we're going to move back to this one, and then we're going to move on further. We got out of the two ones that I find bad and awful, and now we're actually into the very good. There's no episode left to talk about that scored less than a 4 out of 5 stars for me. So this episode, I think, is not only one of the more underrated episodes, but it's low-key one that I constantly crave to watch. And the episode in question is Awesome Ants, and it's also included on this Headless Ghost DVD with Teacher's Pet here. Now, Awesome Ants, in my opinion, is one of the most underrated episodes from the original show, like I said. This one, I do remember, is written by Neil Shusterman, and that sticks out in my memory bank about it. But this one, kind of like its predecessors as well, they take the concept from the short story. Now, the short story for this one was put in the Halloween collection, like book 4, and it's very out of place there. But what Shusterman and the team was able to do with this is kind of bring more fun and chaotic creature feature ways to the story that I can really admire. The main characters are Dave and Ben, like the short story, and the kids want to find a science project, and they find this comic book or some ad about a ant farm, let's just say, and the ant farm comes with this food that they're given instructions not to overfeed them, and they ignore it so they can essentially grow. You know, if you get this comparison, they try to mutate the biggest pumpkin to win the contest, let's just say. Well, what happens is the ants may or may not get big in the episode counterpart and balloon out of their farm, and they start to take over the town. And there's like a kooky pest guy that's not in the short story as well, that is really charming. And there's some over-the-top things. And as you can see, just on this picture alone, the ant coming after the kid, it's fun. And the twist at the end kind of recontextualizes humanity and the costs of what Dave and Ben in scientific research has done, because they're, playing around with animals and playing God a little bit. It's thought-provoking, kind of like the short story counterpart, which does the twist a bit differently. I don't want to give it away or anything, but mostly similar. This is one of the more faithful ones, except, with the additions here, and especially like the opening scene and stuff like that. I don't know, this just screams a fun episode. This is one of the ones you just turn your brain off and have fun. Yeah, it has some dated effects. Yeah, there's some aspects to it that are kind of draggy, that kind of just throw you into the anthill, so to speak, without actually building on anything or setting it up in a good exposition kind of way. There's some faults to it. It has some, pacing issues here and there, but I think this is like a 4 out of 5 contender all day long, all day in the play. It's a low, very good B minus, but it's a solid episode, and more people need to give it attention. So there's that one. Now moving on further, this and the next one kind of fluctuate. They both have a 4.2 out of 5 star rating for me. So on any given day, I can change my mind. But I went with this placement for the number 6 spot just because I feel like it's deserved here. And that is The House of No Return. Now, this is a very famous short story within the Tales That Give You Goosebumps lineup. It was pretty much the frontrunner book for the sneak preview that released before that first book came out. It got adapted in many other things as well. It's like the representation story for the series. It also got put in like a Barnes & Noble short story collection by R.L. Stine as a representative for Goosebumps, which is insane to me. But, yeah, the episode adaptation is pretty much the entire short story, faithfully. But the concept of the short story, while it's basically as average as you can get, is tweaked here to include more dynamicism with the character in question, who is Chris Wakely, who is a fan favorite Goosebumps protagonist, and makes him stand out even more so because you get his actual perspective in the story, which is essentially just Chris is a new kid in town, but these three jerks who run this danger club or thrill club or whatever have hazed pretty much every kid in town, and they need a fourth member for some reason. So they look at Chris as their next opportunity to pretty much try to lock into a haunted house for 30 minutes. And if he can survive in there for 30 minutes, he's going to be initiated into the club, and they now have a fourth friend, and I guess what they're after, right? But in the episode version, you get more of Chris's perspective of him being a new kid and him moving to this town. And it spends a lot of dynamics jumping from his POV over to the kids. And then, of course, the legend associated with the town. It's pretty much like the short story. You find out what happens. But, like I said, you also get more of Chris's POV in the situation than you do in the short story. For that alone, I think the short story counterpart, I gave like the most average rating for those, which is like a 3.5. But because this episode makes those dynamic swings, I'm willing to bump it up a whole lot more, like I said. And the only reason why I have it this low is just because it's not really the most exciting episode. It's very boring at parts. It's not that entertaining. There's some aspects to the short story I kind of wanted them to tweak, but they just didn't do it. And they could have made the story pop a bit better. It feels like it's missing something to make it full-on great. It has the iconic twist ending that gave a lot of kids nightmares, including myself when I first watched it back in the Cartoon Network days of the re-airing. So take that for what you will. But yeah, this one, I don't know. I don't really think about it often, but when I do, I kind of admire some things about it. And yeah, it's pretty solid. Now, the next one here in number 5. So now I guess we're in the top 5, really. But this, I don't really consider this a top 5. I consider this like a top 4. So this is going to be the last of the bottom 5. We have an adaptation, which is included on this disc here. It's called Click. Now, Click also comes from the first Tales That Give You Goosebumps book, like Teacher's Pet, like Strained Peas, like The House of No Return. And this was the 4th and final one they did here. And it stars Dan Wary-Smith playing the very memorable character, and honestly one of the more memorable characters from the short stories, Wholesale, Seth Gold. And there's the urban legend associated with Click that Adam Sandler and whoever wrote the script for Click, the Adam Sandler movie, plot robbed Goosebumps because the concepts are eerily similar. And it's most likely, if they were to plot rob, it would be the episode, because the episode feels more congruent here. Now, Click is like its predecessors as well. It takes the concept from the short story and tweaks it up, partly due to budget and partly due to oversight in trying to fix hindsight issues with the concept and make it a little more full and try to build on some things the short story didn't try to build on. The short story is essentially like Seth, he comes across this remote when his dad brings it home and notices that it has all these features, and he kind of goes throughout the story doing some mundane things with it. And then he gets to a point where he gets caught at school after using it too much and the batteries are running low and his peers try to take it from him, and it causes this weird finale. The episode, though, spends a lot more focus on playing God and having power and abusing power and going that arc with it. And you kind of watch Seth, who's an average kid, just go from okay, I guess, to a bad person after it all, and watch how this thing like mutates his personality and how he behaves and how he treats his friends. It's pretty well done for what it is. The effects can be dated here at times. It doesn't have near as good of a climax as the short story does. It barely even has one to call it that. And there's some goofy humor that sometimes works, sometimes doesn't in this. But I still give this like a 4.2 out of 5 stars. It used to be one of my favorite episodes when I was like in middle school. But no, I no longer think that. I do feel like there's some missed opportunities here with this episode. Kind of like the House of No Return. To kind of fix some of the ailments of the short story. And make it feel a little more whole. But yeah, this is one that I think a lot of people know about, but it's not quite there to be in my top 4, so that's why I place it here. So now we're in the top 4, and these are the episodes that I absolutely love from the show. I know Awesome Ants, Click, and The House of No Return, those episodes kind of all blend for me, but these feel more like I think about them a lot. And it might shock a lot of people that I have this episode, or these episodes, I should say, this low, because it's an iconic two-parter. But it's just how I feel at the end of the day. So, sue me. But my number 4 is going to Perfect School. Now, I have here a little sealed DVD promotional thing they did back in the day of it, and I never plan to open it. But, yeah, The Perfect School is an iconic episode. It has the guy who played Wesker in the Resident Evil movies playing another very memorable Tales to Give You Goosebumps protagonist, Brian O'Connor. He's right up there with like Seth Gold, maybe a few others that are super memorable. But Brian O'Connor is fantastically acted in this episode. Everybody knows this as the school episode and how it tries to play more into Twilight Zone for the TV series. And like its counterparts, it could be a lot faithful at times, and this one is actually one of the more faithful adaptations, but this one definitely tries to build onto scenes that you can see in the short story, but it also tweaks an entire aesthetic that's in the short story, which is mainly dealing with robots, as in the episode, I don't know if you can see via this picture, but that's an umbilical cord. Yeah, just use your mind of what they're doing with, with kids in the school. Yeah, it's kind of taboo, but this is the only two-parter adaptation that the TV show got for the Tales to Give You Goosebumps adaptations. And fun fact, it was originally only supposed to be one part, but the studio, or I guess Fox, liked the concept so much they wanted them to add a second part to it, which I think is probably the biggest weakness to it, in my opinion. This episode is basically spot on the short story. Brian, he's picking on his younger brother, and he goes too far, and his parents realize that he needs some corrective action taken on him. So they decide to ship him off to the school called the Perfect School to hopefully shape him up and teach him a lesson. And he meets some friends along the way, but at the school, he notices the dean, the headmaster, or whatever you want to call him, is very foreboding, and the kids in the school are all afraid to kind of stand up to teachers who are obviously like going against the kids in a bad way. And Brian has an idea to kind of act up, and the episode definitely does its own things with it, where Brian tries to escape one night, and he gets the attention of all the monitors around the school property, and he has to get back in his room in time so he doesn't get caught. It's definitely a tense episode, and I think it's more tense than the short story counterpart is at times. And the inclusion of a certain character and more red herrings is really refreshing, where Brian doesn't know who to trust, and as he's going along this mystery, he finds more and more bits of information, and seems to think that kids just come in and they come out completely different, and they're not who they are. And quite literally, you find that out in the back half of part 2. But the main weakness to this episode, and why I put it below most of these things, and is just how draggy it feels. Especially once we're done with part one, part two kind of hits this snag where like basically nothing's really happening that's all too important for like the first 10 minutes of it. And while I can appreciate them trying to add on to the story, the stuff that did work they added on shows to me that the old show lived and died by the 20 to 21 minute time crunch. They really did not need to do that with this. Really do wish back in the day they were able to do like 35-minute episodes here and there and give that, get that trajectory down to 35 to 42 minutes and go on the higher end only if you need it. They didn't need it for this one, and you could tell they were starting to stretch themselves super thin with it. And it kind of shows that they didn't really have much else ideas to add on to it other than to just kind of drag it, which is sad. But nonetheless, I gave this episode, I think from memory, either a 4.6 or a 4.7 out of 5. It's right on that cusp. Take it or leave it. But yeah, I still really love this episode. The ending is absolutely iconic as well. I can drone on and on about all my other positives with it. The shocking stuff that you don't expect to see in kids' horror. All that is encompassed with my emotions with this one. So yeah, deserve it at my number 4 spot. Now at my number 3, this is probably the most divisive and most all over the place episode within the fandom. But I know this episode has a staunch cult following out there. And for all you cult followers of this episode, you get what we're doing here. And the episode in question is An Old Story. An Old Story, right? The episode where you got child predators, taking kids, turning them old, and trying to sell them into forced marriages. Yeah, it's controversial. Don't get me wrong. Nobody is ever going to deny that An Old Story is controversial. If it's icky for you, I get it. If you don't like the subject matter, if you think it's too far in kids' horror, I would actually agree with you there. But because it's so different and because it feels more adult in some aspects to it, I really love this thing. It's so thought-provoking, and you can clearly tell what the moral of the story is and the lessons that should be learned and what the allegory is, that I weirdly love it. You know what I mean? And a lot of people confuse what the allegory is for this episode. People seem to think, oh, this is an allegory for grooming. It's not really an allegory for grooming, as the grooming aspect is up front. An allegory is something that's under the subtext, right? What they're doing here is kind of talking about growing up too fast and growing old and not enjoying your youth. And you can see that with the kids' reaction in the story. Tom and John are played by two, not John's character, but Tom is played by one of my favorite kids' horror actors of all time, Kyle Downs. And Aunt Dahlia has to be one of my favorite kids' horror villains, if only because the thing she's willing to do to children is insane. It's insane. And she has some of the highest threat levels ever. Even though she doesn't outright kill anybody, it's just what she's willing to do is just awful. And, take it or leave it. Whether you love to hate her or hate to love her, Aunt Dahlia is goated. I don't care what you say. Now, the concept, either way, this is one of the surprisingly more faithful ones. The only noticeable difference is in the Old Story episode versus the short story counterpart is the ending and the concept of how to de-age yourself. In the short story, I think it's wrinkle remover, and in the episode, it's baby food. But everything else is pretty much rock solid. Tom and John, a pair of brothers who are left to be babysat by their estranged Aunt Dahlia, and they never really have met her or remember her, and she is kind of eclectic and weird, and she feeds them these prune cookies because they're so hungry and they have no food in the house, and these prune cookies overnight kind of change them into aging, and they start getting older, and then as the story goes along, Aunt Dahlia invites her friends over, and her friends seem to be interested in these older gentlemen, and then the kids keep aging into old men, and they uncover this plot while they're trying to hide from Aunt Dahlia and her friends that Aunt Dahlia is possibly trying to sell them to these women, and they realize that they got to fight back and do something. And in both versions, you'll see what happens, and mild spoiler, they do come out on top. Now, the implications of the twist do vary. I do think, for me, I prefer the ending wholesale more in the short story because it's more thought-provoking and actually chilling. And the way the parents are kind of connected in the story also is different here. I kind of prefer I kind of prefer it in the short story as well on that department. But the one aspect I think gives this episode a whole lot of charm is the baby food thing. That plays into the twist ending of the episode. It's that's probably my least favorite thing about it, to be honest. It's just corny for the sake of being it. I guess they needed a lighthearted moment after going through, I guess, more touchy subject matter, let's just say. But yeah, this is such a weird, unorthodox thing, and I loved it. I think I'd give this like maybe like a 4.7 out of 5 stars. It might be a contender for my top 10 favorite episodes of the show. I think about this one whenever I think about the show, and I'm glad they made this one. This comes from the Halloween book as well. They literally picked the two furthest removed from Halloween short stories to adapt from book 4. So take that for what you will. But yeah, this is my number 3, and I'm going to stick by it. Now, my top 2 are essentially interchangeable on my mood, and I went with this one because I just feel in my hardest of hearts, this is how I feel. And at number 2, this was actually the very first Tales That Give Me Goosebumps episode adaptation the show got. I think it comes from season 2. The episode in question is Don't Wake Mummy. And like its predecessors, it also takes the concept from the short story and tweaks it a bit. And what I love about the episode off the bat from its short story counterpart is the fact that the short story does this whole angle kind of similarly to the episode here, where you have this family led by this kid named Jeff, who's the youngest in the family. He's kind of a whiny kid, but understandable because when you see how his sister treats him and how his father's always away over in Egypt doing research and his mom is left behind to take care of him, you can definitely see that he's more estranged and just wants to be left alone. But his father accidentally mails home a sarcophagus, or in the episode case, I think it was on purpose, maybe in the short story as well. So the wife can decipher a message written on the side of the sarcophagus, which is thousands of years old, and she also has Egyptologist roots like her husband. And they essentially put the sarcophagus down in the basement, and Jeff and his older sister, I think Kim, in the short story, they're playing around, kind of joking with each other, and they accidentally unleash the mummy, and it plays a role in the climax when the dad comes home, and the family has to stop the mummy within the house, and it may or may not involve, I don't want to give it away, but the older sister as well, which is awful. But the episode takes the idea and keeps the dad over in Egypt and adds a friend character with Kim and more lighthearted elements, but also more chilling elements and more intimate interactions with Jeff and this mummy as it's come alive. And there's the iconic mummy cat that you see in the twist as well. But I think the episode's climax is a whole lot more tense than the short story counterpart. I mean, this is some of the best tension I've seen in the Goosebumps show. And yeah, I know this one is starting to become a new sleeper hit fan favorite episode from the show, and for good reason. Don't Wake Mummy is an absolute classic. I think it's in a top 10 contender for me, easily, because I watch this one a lot. This is probably my favorite mummy-themed episode across any show, and that's saying something here. Goosebumps made something memorable. I'd probably give this like a 4.7 out of 5 stars as well. Very solid episode. Very, very good. Great. Now, my only weaknesses with it, of course, some acting here and there can be spotty from Jeff, and some scenes are kind of cringy, but aside from those things, it's fun. It's fun enough. But that leaves my number 1. My number 1, what's the best Tales That Give Me Goosebumps episode adaptation? And I probably picked the most in-name only one, the most unfaithful one. But I love this episode to pieces. I absolutely love it. It's The Haunted House Game. And yes, it's included on the same collection that The House of No Return was included on. And The Haunted House Game, in my opinion, is the absolute most underrated episode from the whole show, next to Cry the Cat. I love this thing. And yes, let's get the negatives out the way first. Jonathan and Nadine, they're very surface level characters early on, and you kind of have, it's one of those episodes where you have to learn their characters as the story goes along because it throws you into the madness immediately. And if you're not programmed to like that setup for exposition or getting to know characters, it might not do it for you, but I'm able to kind of see their personalities a little more than others as the story goes along. And Benjamin Plenner, he gets a lot of crap for playing Jonathan. Yeah, his acting isn't great or anything, but he's at least charming, right? And those are pretty much my only two negatives with it. Other than that, this episode is just bona fide fun. It's also some of the most creepy things that stick with me within the show whenever I think about it. So Jonathan and Nadine in this version is completely different from the short story counterpart or even the Totally Fox Kids fill-in-the-blank fan version of the story. Yes, there's 3 versions of the Haunted House game out there. If you're curious, you can check them all out. But this version goes against the short story counterpart, which is essentially Jonathan, Nadine, and I think like 2 twin sisters. They're on like a haunted house, overnight, and they're trying to find something to do during a thunderstorm, and they pull out this game called the Haunted House game to play, but every time they make a move in the game, it seems to affect the surroundings in the nearby area within the house. Like you'll hear something tapping the window or something upstairs screaming bloody murder. It's stuff like that, and then it's kind of creepy, intense, and it builds up into a Deus Ex Machina twist about what's really going on with the kids, right? The episode is far removed from that. Jonathan and Nadine are 2 unsuspecting kids wandering around in their neighborhood after just filming something, and they find this girl in distress in front of this house who tells them that her cat is pretty much stuck inside of the home and she needs them to go rescue it. So Nadine is the braver one of the 2, and Nadine goes in first and Jonathan follows. But once they enter the house, they don't find a cat, but they find this game called the Mansion of Terror game. And when they open it up, it sucks them inside the board game. And Jonathan and Nadine literally have to traverse this board game of sorts that is life-size, essentially. And they roll these giant dice, and they get put into these rooms, these various rooms throughout the episode, where one is like a funeral wake with a dead cadaver corpse with a broken finger. It's gross. Another one is a ship captain coming after them for a specific thing. And then you have these 2 old women dressed up in doll outfits with rotted teeth, trying to turn Nadine old and stuff like that. And they come across these other kids who perhaps might be trapped in the game, and they have to figure out a way out using some things they've picked up throughout the game. It's just a really fun adventure-themed episode through and through. The characters are entertaining. There are some clunky moments. There are some clunky moments in the editing, and how that can be depressing as well. But I just have a ball with this. This is just pure fun incarnate. This to me is the poster child for the Tales That Give You Goosebumps episode adaptations. This takes the most risks. It's the most revisitable out of them, in my opinion, because it's nothing like the short story counterpart or even recognizable to it. And honestly, I love it. I'd probably give this thing maybe honestly, I don't know if I gave it like a 4.7 out of 5 stars when I reviewed it a while ago, but I'm willing to bump this up to a 4.8 if I haven't already done so. This is easily a top 10 episode for me. I love this thing through and through. It's my absolute favorite adaptation from this show. So yeah, that's my Tales to Give You Goosebumps episode ranking from worst to best. Let me know down in the comments section, out of those episodes, how would you rank these episodes? Which one is your least favorite? And tell me all the way up to your top favorite. I want to know your guys' list. And like I always tell you, Goosebumps is kind of like an ice cream buffet. You can like a certain flavor and hate a certain one, but somebody else can like the flavor you hate and also dislike the flavor that you really love. That's the beauty of it. It's all a flavor buffet, and just take that for what you will, all right? So, yeah, share with me all your guys' thoughts about that, and I'll see you next time.